What if the borders of the Middle East were never meant to exist? What if the map we see today was drawn in secret during a war? In 1916, as World War I raged across Europe, two European powers were making a deal behind closed doors. A deal that would reshape an entire region, and its consequences are still being felt today. Before World War I, most of the Middle East was controlled by one empire. The Ottoman Empire had ruled the region for centuries. At its height, it stretched across parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But by the early 1900s, the empire was weakening. Internal struggles and external pressure were taking their toll. European powers were watching closely. They saw an opportunity. In 1916, Britain and France began secret negotiations. The goal was simple: to divide the Middle East after the war. Two men led this plan: Mark Sykes of Britain and Francois-Georges Picot of France. Together they drew lines across a map. These lines would decide the future of millions of people. But there was one major problem. The lines ignored reality on the ground. Different ethnic and religious groups were divided. Others were forced together inside artificial borders, and none of this was discussed with the people who lived there. At the same time, while this secret deal was being planned, Britain was making promises to Arab leaders. These promises were made during World War I. Britain wanted Arab support against the Ottoman Empire. In return, Arab leaders were promised independence. They were told they would have their own nations after the war. One of the key figures in this movement was Sharif Hussein of Mecca. He led what became known as the Arab Revolt. Arab forces fought alongside the British. They believed they were fighting for their future independence. But behind the scenes, the reality was very different. The Sykes-Picot Agreement had already divided their land. Britain and France had no intention of creating fully independent Arab states. Instead, they planned to control the region themselves. The promises made during the war directly contradicted the secret deal, and the people involved did not know. This created one of the biggest political betrayals in modern history. When the war ended, the truth began to emerge. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, but instead of independence, the Middle East was divided according to the agreement. Britain and France took control of large parts of the region, and the promises made during the war were not fully honoured. The consequences would shape the region for generations. While these borders were being established, many local communities began to react. Some groups resisted foreign control, hoping to gain the independence they had been promised. In several regions, uprisings began to emerge against colonial rule. These were not just political conflicts, they were struggles over identity, land, and self-determination. In Iraq, resistance movements formed against British control. Local leaders challenged the authority of foreign administrators. Similarly, in Syria, opposition grew against French rule. Protests and revolts became more common as people rejected external control. These early conflicts showed that the borders drawn on maps did not reflect the realities of the people living there. Different communities had different histories, identities, and expectations. But the new political systems often forced them into a single structure. Over time, this created instability within many of the newly formed states. Government struggled to maintain unity across diverse populations. In some cases, tensions remained hidden beneath the surface. In others, they led to open conflict. The legacy of these decisions became more visible as the decades passed. As countries developed, the borders created during this period continued to influence politics and society. Even today, many analysts point to these early decisions as a key factor in understanding modern tensions in the Middle East. Some historians argue that the Sykes-Picot Agreement laid the foundation for future instability. Others believe that while the agreement played a role, later political decisions also shaped the region significantly. There are also broader discussions about whether external powers were primarily focused on long-term influence and control. These interpretations vary, and historians continue to debate the full impact of these events. But one thing is widely agreed upon. The borders drawn in the early 20th century did not simply define geography. They shaped politics, identity, and conflict for generations. More than a century later, the effects of these decisions are still visible. The borders created after World War I continue to define countries today, but many of these borders remain sources of tension. In several regions, conflicts can be traced back to how these borders were drawn. Political instability has often followed these artificial divisions. Some countries have faced repeated internal struggles. Others have experienced long-term regional disputes. And many of these challenges are deeply connected to decisions made over a century ago. However, not all historians agree on a single explanation. Some argue that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was the main cause of instability. Others believe that later political decisions played an even bigger role. Wars, leadership changes, and external interventions all influenced the region. The reality is complex. History is rarely shaped by a single event. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement remains one of the most significant moments. It represents a time when powerful nations reshaped the world in secret, and when decisions made far away affected millions of lives. There are also broader discussions about the motivations behind the agreement. Some theories suggest that control over future resources played a role in these decisions. However, historians continue to debate these interpretations. What is clear is that the agreement had lasting consequences. It shaped borders, politics, and identities, and it continues to influence global events today. The Middle East we see today is, in part, a result of that moment in 1916. A reminder that lines drawn on a map can shape the course of history.